I am Amrita. To begin, we should also thank all those people who have made it possible for all of you to come together. Our resource partners and our Ambedkar University Delhi and Gender at Work, who are our knowledge partners. And last but not the least, partners who have been critical to the making of this conference, Non-Traditional Livelihoods Network, who are co-hosting this conference with us. The Non-Traditional Livelihoods Network was seeded in 2015, and in 2018 they have become a collective with the signing of a charter. And we have 27 members in this collective, and most of the members are here today as participants or have been critical to planning panels in this session. The other partner who is very, very critical is Sakha. Sakha is our transport partner and a very integral part of Azad. Sakha helps all those women whom Azad trains, all those marginalized women whom Azad trains. Sakha helps them get employment as professional chauffeurs. And some of these professional chauffeurs were driving all of you and were assisting you to have a safe ride. So we have to thank them for that. We live in a world of paradoxes today. While on one end, we are witnessing the fourth industrial revolution, an era of technology and artificial intelligence, we are still struggling to enable a just and equitable space for decent work, for wages, for even recognition for some people. Thus, women's and other gender minorities and other intersections' productive potential continues to be undermined, even though they do contribute to almost 70% of the world's work. They still earn less than 10% of the world's wages. This conference will begin primarily on day one with this big question: to understand the challenges in the world of women and work. We look afresh at these challenges in the context of the rapidly emerging technology, keeping in mind the global history of struggle by women's movement for women's right and work. On day one, after establishing the bigger question, we also understand how non-traditional livelihoods has the potential to challenge gender barriers and the potential to create better livelihood opportunities and decent work. On day two, we will take this conversation a little deeper and understand how creation of ecosystems that are supportive, ecosystems at home, ecosystems around us in the market where we all operate, ecosystems in communities, ecosystem in any public space, supportive ecosystems, and how they are very critical to women not only entering jobs, and when I mean women here, I am talking about intersections of all marginalized categories, not only joining but also sustaining their presence in the world of work. On day three, we will take this a little more further and understand about how we will be how advocating about global policy needs to understand the concept of promotion of decent livelihoods for the marginalized. A few ground rules that we need to set for today, and a few announcements regarding translations and regarding keeping your phones on silent. I'm sorry, I just heard a phone ringing and hence I had to say it. Request you all to please keep your phones in silent and take a call outside the conference so that the others are not disturbed. Regarding translations, we are arranging for simultaneous translations for a few people who have not been from different parts of the world. So We are trying to organize for translations as ongoing translations. Some of these are ongoing translations, and some of these are translations on the headset. The headsets have been distributed to a few of you. So, request you all to, whenever you speak, to keep in mind that translations are ongoing and hence not have parallel conversations, so that everybody can benefit from this enriching discussion. Thank you. I would begin the day with an inaugural, we would begin today with an inaugural address by Professor Jayati Ghosh. Professor Jayati Ghosh is a development economist and professor of economics, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Ghosh's research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment, patterns in developing countries, macroeconomic policy, issues related to gender and development. She has authored several books and more than 100 scholarly articles and has been the recipient of many accolades as well. She was the principal author of West Bengal Human Development Report, which received the 2005 UNDP Award for Excellence in Analysis. She was co-recipient of the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Research Prize, awarded in 2010, the Satyendra Award by the Asiatic Society Kolkata in 2012, and recently the Malcolm Adishesha Prize for Contributions to Development Studies in 2017. Professor Ghosh is one of the founders of the Economic Research Foundation in New Delhi, a non-profit trust devoted to the progressive economic research. She is also the executive secretary of the International Development Economic Associates, a network of economists critical of the mainstream economic paradigm of neoliberalism. In addition to her academic work, she is a regular columnist for several newspapers and journals in India. She also maintains an active interest in Western classical music. We welcome you, Professor Ghosh.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and just to sense the variety and the energy in this hall is already quite inspiring for many of us. I was one of the people who was lucky enough to come in a Sakha taxi, and that already created a flurry in my household, and I think provided inspiration to several people who said, well, we can send our daughters for this as well. So, as I said, it's really a great pleasure to be part of this event. I'm going to just begin with a little bit of the context. I think Amrita mentioned that the morning is about talking about challenges. I have to confess it's very easy to talk about the challenges because there's so many of them. And in a sense we all know them already, but just to state them, it's less easy to talk about the solutions, or at least the strategies to resolve these challenges, but I'm going to try a little bit to do both. So, globally, one unfortunate feature we know is that wherever jobs are scarce or seem to be scarce, women tend to get rationed out of them. And this is not just an old sociological fact, but this is something that has actually intensified over the last 3 decades. There's very useful research by the UN, by the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report of 2017, which actually finds that this is true for a whole range of both developed and developing countries. That where jobs in particular sectors are declining, which are seen to be attractive, whether they are in manufacturing or organized services, there you find a lower and lower proportion of women get actually employed in them. And there are many reasons for this. Of course, there are the old patriarchal reasons and the burden of unpaid work within households and the social and cultural reasons that prevent women from access. But there is also this straightforward tendency that unless women are seen to be hugely advantageous because of lower wage rates, employers tend to prefer men. Now, there are many ways of dealing with this, but And they are socially specific, they differ from country to country. But nonetheless, this is the first phenomenon that we have to recognize. This is a process that is actually global. But then there is this other weird process, and we in India are, if you like, the classic example of this. And earlier I used to say that India is unique. India is unique because we have 3 decades of very rapid growth, income, GDP growth. We are seen now as one of these emerging economies that has a huge potential for the future and is already one of the most dynamic. And yet we have declining women's workforce participation. That is to say, recognized workforce participation. Now, this was in fact unusual. Most patterns of development have actually experienced the opposite. That when countries grow rapidly, especially with export-oriented growth, more and more women get employed in recognized work, and often there's a doubling of these work participation rates. In India, we've seen the opposite. Unfortunately, now there are more and more countries that are showing this trend, including in Asia. Even countries like China, Malaysia, etc., are showing declines in women's workforce participation. And this phenomenon is something which therefore we can no longer say is also just confined to India. But when we unpackage what is happening in India, we discover that there are 2 broad things going on. Three, okay. One is of course the fact that more and more younger women are getting educated, which is a good thing, which we're happy about, yes, which we want. There's a bad side to that one as well, I'll come to it in a minute. Another is that there is a significant increase in the proportion of women who have to spend time in what I would call unpaid domestic work plus. Now what's the plus? There is an unpaid domestic work which everyone knows about. Looking after the young, the old, the sick, the elderly, and cooking, cleaning and all of that. And then there's the plus, that is collecting fuel wood for domestic use, collecting water for domestic use, doing kitchen gardening, doing poultry raising, doing a lot of economic activities which are not classified as recognized work. We find that the proportion of women in India who are doing that has increased hugely. So if you look only at recognized work in India, then only 24% of Indian women supposedly work. But if you look at all of that, if you add all of the other kinds of work, then you find 88% of women in India are working. Slight difference, right? Now, this burden of unpaid work has actually grown because of the things that have demanded more time from women, like collection of water. So we now find that 40% of these women who are doing unpaid work, a major amount of their time is spent on collection of water. So it is also, if you like, government indifference to this unpaid labor. That means that there's no priority to delivering these amenities, this basic infrastructure, or to delivering basic care services. And so women's unpaid work provides a huge subsidy to the so-called formal economy. It's an unrecognized but enormous subsidy. And this is certainly true in India, it's increasingly true in many other developing countries as well. But then of course, there is the third issue, which is that, as I mentioned, we definitely have an increase in women's education. And the other good news is that wherever women are educated, and especially girls are educated, you find their performance is better than boys. At the school level, at the undergraduate level, pass percentages are higher, the number of women who get better quality degrees is higher, all of that is true. Yet, unemployment among such young women is also extremely high and rising. The few sparse data that we have, this government, as you know, doesn't allow us data. It just destroys surveys, doesn't release surveys, or doesn't actually undertake surveys because it doesn't want the truth to come out. But we do still have information which tells us that the highest rate of unemployment in India is among young women, women in the age group 16 to 25. That's the highest rate of unemployment. Between 25 to 30% of young women in that age category are available for work, looking for it, and not finding it. That's just all women in that category, young women. If you look at educated women in that category, the rates go up to above 30%. So 1 out of 3 educated young women is not able to find a job. Now that's a job crisis of a different order. It's not just the overall thing, it is the fact that even with education, it doesn't ensure that you will get a job. In fact, it's almost harder to find a job. Not necessarily something commensurate with your education, because we even know that people are willing to apply for jobs way below their level of education qualification if it is a regular, secure job. So it's a job crisis of a different order. Once we recognize that challenge, one of the solutions actually, which I will talk about later, comes immediately. But there's another issue I want to mention, and I think it was already mentioned by Amrita earlier, the fourth industrial revolution, so-called, the impact of technology on jobs. Now, everywhere you go, we hear this thing that, oh, you know, the robots are coming, automation will destroy our jobs, artificial intelligence means that they're going to take over everything, even clerical and other jobs that were earlier immune to displacement. So there's this huge fear being generated, led by Davos, if you like, led by the World Economic Forum, but also encouraged by the other international organizations. There's this huge fear of the new technological revolution displacing lots of employment. Now, I would argue that this is actually looking at it the wrong way. And it's almost as if there's this huge bogey of technological change being set up to scare us all, to terrify workers into saying you cannot demand your rights, because if you do, then you'll just be displaced by a machine that has no rights anyway. You cannot actually ask for better conditions. You cannot demand more work because, let's face it, you're just lucky to have any paid work. That's the basic thrust of the argument. This is false. It's false. Why? Because it assumes that jobs that are displaced in one particular activity are not replaced by jobs in other activities. Now, the reason this is happening is not because there is no potential for work in a particular economy. It's happening because governments are choosing not to undertake policies that would give you more employment. It's a political choice. It's not an economic necessity. It's a political choice in what way? If we actually had governments that were willing to invest properly in the care economy, that were willing to invest properly in creative industries, we could actually generate many, many more multiples of the jobs that exist. And in fact, we find that this is also true if you look at it in terms of comparative data. Let me give you one small example in terms of the care of public employees engaged in care work in a population. You can, in a way, imagine that the number of public employees per population is some indication of the kinds of facilities, public services we provide to people. Because public employees are not just bureaucrats sitting in offices with files. They are also teachers, they are also nurses, they are also doctors, they are also security people, they are accountants working for these institutions, they are care services of all kinds, many, many different public services. The less number of public employees you have per population, the less work you have, the less quality of services you provide to your society. So let's take the global average. The global average is around 3.5 per 100. Okay? In the United States, it's 5 people per 100. In Europe, it's 6 people per 100. In the Scandinavian countries, which provide the best, if you like, in terms of public services, it's between 8 and 12 people per 100. In India, it's less than 2. So we are under-providing basic services to our people. And that really means that we are not just denying them jobs, but we're also lowering the quality of life of all our population. And secondly, and of course then you look at Africa and it's around 1. So really, the number of public employees per population is an indication. And it's also a sign of how much we're losing by not delivering public services to our population, both in terms of employment and in terms of the fact that such employment will create multiplier effects. So what is a multiplier effect? Basically, it's the idea that if I employ somebody, pay them 1,000 rupees, they tend to spend most of that money. Especially the lower the wage, the more likely you are to spend all of your wage. The more you spend that money, the more you are generating income for someone else. You spend that money, that becomes somebody else's income, and then they demand out of that money. And so this money multiplies. In countries like India, where you spend on very labor-intensive activities, the multiplier can be as high as 3 or 4 or 5. So for every 100 rupees you spend, you're generating 400 rupees. Additional income, additional activity, additional employment. It can be what the American economist Hyman Minsky called a bubbling up strategy of growth. We live in a trickle-down world. We see all of that money at the top, all the wealth at the top, and we're hoping little drops of it trickle down to us. It's possible to think of a bubbling up world. And it's a political choice. It's not an economic necessity. Okay, so if this is the extent of the challenges, let me briefly just talk about what could be done, what is to be done. And not just in terms of overall employment increases, but increasing the possibilities for non-traditional work of women, where we know that society, patriarchy, politics, everything combines to actually push women out of preferred jobs. First, I would argue, we have to have dramatic increases in public employment. And we have to demand those, not just because it is public employment that gives you jobs, but because that improves quality of life for everyone. And that means significant investment, particularly in creative industries and care services. Why do I mention these two? Because these are two activities that are almost immune to the pressures of technological displacement. In other words, they are relational activities. They rely on human creativity, relationality. You cannot get rid of a care job. Technology can help you do it. Technology can assist a care worker. Technology cannot fully replace a care worker, ever. Similarly, in the creative industries. And there's much more scope for all of this work globally, in India, in other developing countries, but also in the post-industrial developed countries as well. So significant increase in public employment. Now, the nature of that public employment has to be also much better than it is today in India. In other words, what we've done in India is we've created this whole caste system, class system for perhaps for those who are not familiar with the Indian caste system, but we've created a hierarchy of employees. The very regular, permanent employees with a fixed wage, periodic wage revisions, pensions, all kinds of protection and so on, which is a tiny, tiny proportion of even public employment. Then the contract workers, and then the workers who are not even called workers. Our health workers, ashas, our Anganwadi workers, creches and others, who are not called workers because then they would have to be paid minimum wage. So our government chooses to call them volunteers and pays them 1/10 of the minimum wage. We have to get rid of that and give proper public employment to everyone with good conditions that will generate massive increases in secondary employment through the multiplier effect, as I mentioned, but also it will enable more and more women to access paid work. Women who are forced to do unpaid care work at home because there's no one else available to do it. Women who do not have facilities to actually go out and work. Women who feel unsafe in going to work, commuting to work, or in the workplace because of inadequate security can be provided that kind of security. All of that kind of thing can happen if you actually have very significant increases in proper public employment. A lot of that will pay for itself because of the whole multiplier, GDP growth, tax revenues will also rise, and there are many other ways of financing it. Many of us have done these kinds of calculations. We can tell you that the fact that it's not being done is not because there's no money for it. It's a political choice. So the first point then would be to mobilize to change that political choice. to make it inevitable for any government to actually be forced to have significant increases in good quality public employment. The second thing I would argue, this is of course more controversial, is that finally you have to have some kind of quota reservation for women in jobs, especially in non-traditional work. Why is that? Because essentially, this is very personal, my experience, but I don't know how many of you share this. I have seen over the decades that having one or two women in positions of power is never good enough. They end up having to behave like men. You know? It's not their fault, it's the nature of that whole process. To change the culture of an organization, you have to have sufficient numbers. To make it inevitable that, let us say, childcare is seen as an important part of one's normal life, and somehow work has to be combined with that, and that therefore both have to adjust, the work and the childcare. That knowledge itself does not permeate until you have sufficient women who are currently bearing the entire burden of it. Just maternity, paternity leave is not good enough if you don't have enough people voicing all of those things. The nature of the workplace, the forms of sexual harassment, the nature of the work security, all of these issues do not become issues until you have enough women. The kinds of facilities that are required, the amenities that are required for work, again, those don't become issues until you have enough women experiencing it, voicing it, demanding a difference in the conditions. So, quotas for women, and I would argue in non-traditional work, but also at all levels. The European Union has already instituted it in company boards, but I would argue you really need this at all levels, in management and everywhere as well. We suddenly have a government in India that has rediscovered the joys of quotas. There's a strong case, I would argue, for us to say that the place we also definitely need quotas is for women workers, especially in non-traditional work. The third possible thing I think we need to focus on, and this is also to do with the fact of change in attitudes. So, we all do this. I have been doing them myself. We all believe in gender sensitization workshops and, educating people and educating men and all of that kind of thing. Is that enough? Or does it even work? Because, people sit through these workshops. I have met senior bureaucrats who sat through 5-day workshops and come out saying the most cringe-making, appalling sexist statements because they don't really get it. And then it's one more workshop they have to sit through. It's one more retraining that people have to do. How do we actually change attitudes? I would argue you can't change attitudes just by talking about it. You have to be doing it. You have to be seeing people. My telling various members of my household that women can do anything has been much less effective than many of them seeing this young woman who came to pick me up today, who said happily that of course she does night pickups, of course she drives around. For 6 years she's been going everywhere without any problem. It's been much more effective. In other words, the value of seeing people, the value of role models, I believe has much more impact than just talking about something and saying this is how you should be thinking and this is how you should be feeling and this is what's good for you. That's too much of a moral science class rather than something that is actually impactful. So we have to actually be, in addition to quotas, we have to be actively, all of us associated, in pushing more women out there, in doing our own little bit of affirmative action wherever we can, in choosing women for particular things that we would not earlier have thought that they should be doing. And I think that's important because often we ourselves have various prejudices in terms of what is feasible, what is not feasible. Should my daughter be doing a night shift? Should that kind of thing. So I think we need to be much more proactive in terms of changing attitudes through example rather than simply by mouthing this. And then finally, then there are various organizational things that, of course, people talk about all the time. But there are organizational constraints and institutional constraints that women face, which are huge, especially self-employed women. In India, that is half of all the recognized workforce of women. Self-employed women in India are 2/3 of the working women. And many of those working women do not have access to credit, to input support, to marketing support, to technology knowledge, to any of the basic things that male entrepreneurs take for granted, and which the biggest capitalists assume is their right. But ordinary small entrepreneur women, and I'm talking at the smallest level in terms of those running petty trade, retail trade, working at home for various, putting out systems effectively, all of those do not have that kind of access, and they do not have the advantages of association. So we really need to encourage cooperatives, but we also need to have special packages which are designed to just provide these basics. Unfortunately, we have to call it a package because, as I said, big companies take all this for granted. It's their due. Small entrepreneurs, we have to actually make sure that they get it on equivalent terms for them to survive. But finally, I would say that we have to rid ourselves of the notion that there is, in fact, this whole idea that what's happening is inevitable. That this is just the nature of capitalism, globalization, technological change. These are all forces beyond the government. We have to rid ourselves of that notion. What is going on is a policy choice in all our countries. And the fact that it's a policy choice is because we as a society have allowed it. And we are allowing it because we are too easily misled by precisely what is fed to us, that these are inevitable forces of history. It's a tsunami of technological change. It is the forces of globalization. It is the nature of the capitalist market system. Nothing we can do about it, is what governments tell us. That's not true. If you look around across the world, there's a huge variety of different institutional conditions, and working conditions, and bargaining conditions, and women's work conditions. And it really means that these are all the outcome of political choice. So I think finally what we really need to do is mobilization. Mobilization that forces governments to recognize that these are political choices and forces them to change those choices in a progressive direction. So I think I've said too much already. Let me stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh. As a token of our appreciation, please accept this lady driver and now we will begin with our first plenary of the day. Before I begin the first plenary, I would want to announce that we are live tweeting, so please use these hashtags when you are tweeting, and so that we are also in sync. And thank you. The first plenary session of the day will discuss about the big questions around women and work. Some of the questions have been already raised and some solutions provided by Professor Ghosh. The idea of work, the unpaid care plus, and how creating public services, how creating public workers will help more women enter the workforce easily. The first session today will be moderated by Ms. Saina Denugara, who's the features editor, CNBC TV 18. I welcome Ms. Saina to please take on the session. Saina is a business journalist, television producer, and writer. Her areas of work have been interpreting the impact of economic and social policies on business, and in turn the impact of on livelihood, education, healthcare, and social progress. She is the producer of India's longest running show on entrepreneurship, CNBC TV 18's Young Turks. I welcome you, Saina. I now request Saina to invite the speakers for this panel.
Good morning, everyone. And pleasure to be here this morning and to moderate this opening plenary. I think I have quite a task at my hand because I literally have panelists from all over the world. I hope in this session what we will find and what we will talk about is our common experiences as women and as workers. Because I think that no matter what part of the world you're in, that commonality of experience will lead us towards solution finding. And those are the two things that we will try and achieve on the session today, is to look at what are the common problems and what are some of the solution approaches that have worked. I will also request all of my panelists to also reflect on the scalability of their solutions that their organizations have implemented, or larger frameworks that have worked in their part of the world, and how we can look at really making them interoperable in a globalized world, so to speak. Right? So while we get there, then the third point, and Jayati Ghosh brought this up, is technology. And I want to look at it actually from the point of view of how technology can be an enabler. Are we thinking of it strongly enough, not in terms of something that's going to take our work away from us, but is going to empower us? What are the new thinkings around the kind of jobs that we need to do? Are women finally going to be sort of de-shackled because of technology? And we'll reflect on some of that as well. So let me introduce the panel to you. I have with me today Marissa Weasley. Marissa Weasley is the Chief Executive Officer at Win-Win Strategies, which is a non-profit social enterprise that connects the power of business or large corporations to deep assets of women's organizations to empower women globally. She's also the member of the Council of Foreign Relations and speaks and writes regularly on issues of women empowerment and rights. That's Marissa. Next up, we have Veni Kusuma, who is the UN Women representative in Nepal. Ms. Kusuma has worked for over 30 years in the fields of women's human rights and gender equality, with a focus on women, race, and security, especially in conflict and post-conflict settings. She previously served as the UN Women Country Representative in Cambodia, and was also the country director of UNIFEM in Afghanistan. Next up, Narni Zulmi Narni, who is the president of ASBE, which is the Asia Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education in Indonesia. Narni has been involved in activism on gender issues in Indonesia since the mid-1980s, and she was one of the founders of ASPA, which is a national network of NGOs working on women's and economic issues in Indonesia. And last but not the least, Dr. Francine Pickup, who is the country director for UNDP here in India. Ms. Pickup has worked with several developmental organizations, including Amnesty International, Oxfam, World Bank, and the United Nations. At the UN, she has worked with several humanitarian and developmental agencies, including the ILO and so on. Prior to this, she was the Deputy Country Director at UNDP Indonesia. And she's not the last, sorry, that was my mistake. I have with me also Theo Shruva. Theo is with the African Women's Development Fund. Now, I don't have my notes on me to fully explain her experience, but she has worked with all of the large and small countries in Africa, looking at connecting funding to women at grassroots levels. And yeah, that's our panel. What I will also do in the hour that we have is we'll go through opening comments, which will highlight the problem statements and some of the issues in each of their countries from a personal historical perspective. And then I will open it up for audience Q&A. Then we will go to the solutions that have worked, and again, I hope for it to be participative. So if there is a point that one of the panelists is making and you want to ask a question, put in a rejoinder or experience share, please raise your hand and we will make you part of the conversation. So on that note, let's begin. Yeah, so I'm going to ask, can everyone hear me? Is this? Yes. All right, great. So Marissa, let me begin with you. From your experience as a working woman in North America, in USA, can you give us a sense of what are 2 or 3 of the biggest impediments or 2 or 3 of the biggest points that you feel have held women back in terms of a larger proportion of participation in the workforce? Perhaps share a little bit of the historical perspective, but also a personal narrative that you find reflects the journey of women at work in your country.
Thank you very much, Nina, and on such a great panel. I will try to be very quick because there's a lot of people who have a lot more to say than I do. Reflecting very briefly historically, I would say that, and I think of historically in this context as sort of in my lifetime, I would say that the major shifts that one's seen in the United States in terms of women in the workforce, and probably a little bit this is true globally as well, relate to major changes in the legal systems and the laws over the past, say, 50 years in terms of jobs that women can access, property rights, violence, a whole range of things that affect women's employment. In my lifetime, Title VII and Title IX in the United States, which both ended discrimination or attempted to end discrimination, passed laws to try to end discrimination in federally funded settings, whether education or otherwise, are very critical. Roe v. Wade, which was a major Supreme Court decision outlawing abortion, was permitting abortion in many cases, was a critical issue for women in the workplace, and those were things that made me think, in my lifetime, the world was going to change. Indeed, the other thing that seemed to have changed in my lifetime was just the nature of what jobs women could do and were thought of as being worthwhile doing. I am 63 years old. I went to Harvard Law School. The first woman admitted to Harvard Law School was 65 years ago. So in my lifetime, basically, the world moved from not even thinking about women in the United States as lawyers to having at least women graduating from law schools in equal numbers, whether they're moving forward. Today, I would say the challenges are that in workplaces, women aren't really advancing. And in workplaces that range from the kinds of privileged workplaces that I was in professional ways to more marginalized and basic professions, the things that are really still keeping women back relate to the unpaid care obligations that Professor Ghosh talked about, that and unpaid care obligations probably don't have the plus in the same way in the United States that we do in some of the developing world, but certainly all the other care obligations in a setting where there's really no safety net or no child care, no real support from a public setting, makes that very, very challenging for women. And indeed, workplaces, though a lot of the discrimination has become more invisible, it has often become a little harder to address with a lot of the same norms that have kept women from becoming leaders in various settings, still being very attitudes, both of men and women, are still very deeply embedded and difficult to shift. Though there are lots of good examples that we'll get to about how that's happening, I will now pass this along to Theo, who has a very different context in West Africa.
Okay. So I suppose from my point of view, one of the things that I am most concerned about or exercised about is the fact that across the globe, we've actually gotten much better, as you said, Marissa, in having legal frameworks that are meant to protect us from discrimination. And that's discrimination whether you're a woman, whether you're black, whether you're in various different types of marginalized groups. But there's a huge gap between developing those policies, choosing which policies we follow up on, and actually implementing the legislation. And one of the things that I see, whether I'm in New York or Accra or Kigali or Delhi, is that there's something we have to do about the way we define and look at work, which will be what truly changes the way in which women participate in the workforce. There are so many women that participate in the workforce now, but we keep referring to it as women in the informal sector. When women work and bring billions into our GDPs, how can we call that informal? And as long as we continue to call that informal, we continue to allow people not to put in the proper social protections that actually would make the so-called informal work more formal. And one of the things I think we all have to do, I think it's very easy for us always to blame someone else, to say it's the government not doing enough, it's the private sector not doing enough, it's bankers not investing enough. But I think that we actually need to take all of this far more personally and actually look at what we accept and don't accept, and what we do and don't do, and what we not just tell, as Professor Ghosh was saying, but what we show our children and other generations. And partly I say this because I work in the fields of philanthropy. The African Women's Development Fund is the first and only Africa-wide women's rights funding foundation. And yet when I look at how we used to fund livelihoods work, but also how so many other governments and aid workers and international philanthropists continue to fund women's livelihood work, we actually were making the problem worse. The fact that
How so? Maybe you want to take an example to explain to us how present structures are making things worse, so even though there's money coming in.
Yeah, okay. So I'll give sort of 3 examples of that. Number one, I have to tell you, I've reached the stage where if one more person tells me about African women being entrepreneurs, I may resort to violence. And I am not a violent woman. But we've had this myth, and it's been forced down, and people keep bringing money. Yes, we'll train this group of women as entrepreneurs, and that group of women as entrepreneurs. And well, you know what? African women have been entrepreneurial for generations. They do not, and we do not need any more training in that field. But by saying, oh, let's do entrepreneurs, people actually try and avoid the social security obligations, sometimes even tax obligations, but the physical security that is needed in work. And also, it brings up the question, if we're saying that all of these African women keep being trained as entrepreneurs, who's training the women scientists? Who's training the women engineers? Who's training the women technicians who are part of the future wave of employment that we can see? And yet, you look at philanthropy, you look at international aid, and ask where the money that is training women for employment is going. We're making it worse. The second thing is that when we do give money, we don't give money in ways that actually truly support women. I see myself as part of the international philanthropy field, and we have so much philanthropy in Africa. I worry that our philanthropy becomes distorted by people's acceptance that philanthropy is only what big, really big northern, often white male people do, as opposed to what African and Asian and global southern philanthropy has been for generations. And when that philanthropy is in place, people aren't thinking about how are we actually promoting women's participation. And one very clear example of that is that you ask international aid people and you ask international philanthropists, how do they fund maternity leave? And they don't. If you are actually writing grants and you're saying we want to make sure that women are able to have maternity leave and able to look after themselves and their children and come back to the safety of their work, they don't fund it. And if you are not funding it, you are giving the message that this is not important. I'll stop there.
Okay, so we'll pick up some of those themes when we talk about solution approaches. But over to you, Nani. From the perspective of growing up working in Indonesia, can you give us a sense of what some of the key challenges in women participation in the workforce, growing the labor force participation has been, and while we are seeing, as Professor Ghosh highlighted earlier, a sort of decrease now in women participation. Is that something that's true for Indonesia, and you want to reflect on that for us, please?
Okay. Thank you. I would like to start with the personal journey on these things. When I was little, I grew up in very poor family. My grandparents are farmers. So most of Indonesian actually farmers during that time, and I always follow my grandmother during holidays, and she does all like 70% of the farming work done by her. And after that, she produce a kind of traditional herbal and sell it in around the community. So she basically the income earner in the family. And still, she also went to she taught the Quran reading for highest level people like the district head in that area. So when I was there, I always believed that women actually work and income earners, but I've never that when my own mothers actually does not work, but she always said women have to work. And then I'm thinking, so what is the meaning of work? And then because my mother not consider my grandmother as workers, while actually she does everything. So in Indonesian context, during the we call it New Order, most of the women work in agriculture, and then we transform we slowly moving to most industrial countries. Then women, a lot of agriculture lands transformed into factories and everything, and then women pushed to enter the job market. So but at the same time, the quality of women's life decreased. So because women enter this labor market as stereotyping, they can pay very low, and that's why the quality of their life was so very low compared when they work in agriculture. So there are the first challenge, of course, the recognition of the women as women have capacity to work. Women are producers. It's not only the household. So I think this is the mindset, not only in the whole society, but also usually internalized by the women themselves. Although they work, but they are not considered as workers. That's why then the efforts to go further is a challenge for them. And the second, now in Indonesia, for example, every 4 family, one actually headed by women. This is because of the poverty and also because of huge migration. Men move to other country for earning but never come back actually, and also never give any income to their family, or they practice polygamous marriage. So with this context, that's even higher women have to work. And the categories of, I very much agree on this, informal and non-formal, formal workers is really marginalized women in the workforce. Many women actually are great entrepreneurs from long time ago. We know women weaving, women painting, women do a lot of things. And also make income, but it's not considered work, and it's not in the statistic. So in my organization, for example, Women Head in Family Empowerment, every woman works, but they are not in the statistic, even in district level. So therefore, there is no protections, there is no opportunities for them to really scaling up. Even though we have many women who work and then have several other women working with them. So that means they give job opportunity for others or poor and contribute to the local economy. But they are not considered as good because they are the informal. Always the industrialized bigger scale is always what's seen as economic, as
the economy or something that you need to
Yes.
aspire to. It's not okay.
Yes.
What you're doing is not enough.
Yes, especially women, usually they create a lot of economic opportunity around whatever they already skill for them.
All right. So we pick up threads from this, but coming to you, Francine, you want to reflect maybe a little bit of your own personal journey, maybe thoughts that you had when you were growing up that have changed, evolved, and you want to then put it in the context of different areas of the world that you've worked in and finally you're in India.
I mean, my personal journey has been one very much focused on gender. So as I was growing up as a teenager in the UK, gender power relations, I mean, I could see them in my daily life, I could see them in decisions that were being made in the home about, you know, various things, access to resources, opportunities, and so on. I decided to focus on gender at university, and then after that I went into my work and focused on gender from working on gender-based violence, specifically working on gender and the workplace. And then over time I felt that I personally could have the most impact by working in a more mainstream institution and trying to influence that. I worked initially in NGOs and then decided to move to the UN because I felt I could influence decision making at a higher level in that forum. So that's a bit my personal journey. It's constantly challenging to do that, but that's my personal journey. I mean, in terms of what I've seen, and I've worked in Middle East, in Asia, and also in Eastern Europe. I mean, there are clearly some common issues in terms of the challenges that women face. I mean, this point about recognizing women's work and breaking down that division between formal and informal is, I think, an important point. And, you know, how do we better value women's work, including the unpaid and the domestic work, is something that we see everywhere. The paradox that we're talking about today that's very much evident in India, you know, there's been a 12% decrease in women's labour force participation in the last 2 decades. I think India is only Saudi Arabia is worse than India in the G20 in that respect. It's really a cause for concern. And, you know, I think we really need to look at whether it's actually development or economic growth that is leading to this decline. You know, that people, households now have or men in households or families now are able to decide it's better for women not to work because they can afford not to work. So there may be a link between women's falling employment despite their rising education related to development. That's something that we're seeing in some states in India, for example. I mean, and you made the point about legislation not being enough, right? It's about implementation. And I think that goes to the importance of tackling cultural norms. And I'm an anthropologist by training, so I understand the challenges around that. But I mean, you know, oftentimes it is a family decision for women not to work, and so we have to look at those issues in the family. I mean, in India, one of the things I've sort of seen is the parda, for example, which is, you know, women's seclusion or segregation from men in public spaces. And I mean, that is certainly a cultural norm in India that needs to be addressed in terms of, you know, stifling women's engagement. And we were very happy to see the decision at the Kap Panchayat in Haryana just yesterday that women should not wear the veil. So it's a small example, but it's a positive one of how things can change. I mean, another thing that we see in many countries, but so much in India, is this issue of safety, women's safety, and the fear of harassment in the home, but also outside the home. You know, the fact that there is this worry that women will be abused or harassed when they leave the home is a big impediment to women's working. And yeah, so that's really an issue that we see here. And then the last one that I wanted to mention in terms of constraints, and I'm really glad to have my colleague from Indonesia next to me. I was in Indonesia before I came to India. One of the things that we worked on there that again is, I think, an important issue is access to finance, and you mentioned it in terms of microcredit. But I mean, it's very interesting to see how, you know, as the private sector is developing, in Indonesia, what we saw was that, you know, the younger generation of business people, women, the daughters of, you know, successful, rich businessmen, are looking at business in a different kind of way. And there are opportunities to engage with them, engage with these new kinds of women business leaders, and look at how we can and how they can help empower women in the private sector and support access to finance for women. I mean, in Indonesia, my impression was it's not so much about microcredit, because there's a lot of lack of microfinance going on. It was more those women in the missing middle who were bigger than micro enterprises, but weren't able to get access to finance from banks. And that was the layer that we thought, you know, needed the most support in terms of mentoring, access to networks, and building their confidence to go out and look for money from investors. So that would be another sort of issue and constraint that you see around the world.
All right. Wendy, for you, I'm afraid we're coming to you last, and you might feel that we've covered a lot of issues. But what stands out for you in your experience as something that's held women back from a personal and historical context?
Thank you very much, Sina. I'm going to start by saying thank you very much to the host, Azad Foundation, but also to Professor Ghosh. I feel like during your talk, I was in conversation with you, and so I thank you, Sina, just for allowing me to raise some additional questions, just to build the dialogue, if I may. So, Francine and I work for the UN, and we struggle with a lot of the challenges that come with working in a bureaucracy. And so you've encouraged us to speak from our personal perspective. I just want to put that right out there, okay? That we deal with bureaucracies. And when I want that conversation with you, Professor Ghosh, I have to start with admitting that when you speak of the perspectives from Davos, it is exactly those perspectives that I, and perhaps Francine, that we must navigate and negotiate with. And so I need to be able to speak to the people of Davos, that ilk, because they are also our donors. And on the one hand, coming from a grassroots perspective, the women's movement, we want very much to support women's mobilization. In fact, that is a core response that's required. With that, we absolutely understand, or I understand my role, is to hold the political decision makers accountable, including myself, for that mobilization, to support it, to be responsive to it. So that being true, I'm also sitting with the hat of where I work. And where I work, we work in essentially, in general, of 5-year periods. You have our planning cycle, so that you might equate us with whatever government we are choosing to work with in our home countries, on whatever level. And we understand that just having 2 5-year plans equals 10 years. Having 3 is 15 years. Having 4 is 20 years. And that the reality bears out that in 20 years, we actually may well have self-driving cars. Not sure, but we may. And I am sitting here wanting to know what the drivers in the room would want us to do with them, for them, in partnership, on behalf of those changes that will come. Whether we fear them or not, I feel very responsible to ask the question, what ought we be doing? And Professor Ghosh, when you talk about those occupations that are immune to technological change, and you highlight the care services, one of the questions that I had was, how will that help? Or what could we do in that view to address occupational segregation when we understand that the care services, the care economy, is one that is largely supported by women in low-waged employment? And if our goal is also to remove those silos, and sitting where I am, understanding that there is that physical set of skills, right, in terms of vocational training, what we might train or retrain on, and then there are the cognitive skills, yeah, and so it is not to say that one is necessarily better than the other, but oftentimes in our planning, in our programming, we tend to hone one and not the other. And we do that in UN Women as well. I must acknowledge that we have inherited a role in the industry of vocational training where a lot of times the resulting physical skills really beg the question of what more ought we be doing. And in this regard, I want to acknowledge that in Nepal, we just went through an enormous national exercise in a shift from the physical to the cognitive. This is really important, where just last year we had our first local elections in 20 years. And lo and behold, through the gender quota in elections, we now have 14,000 plus women in elected office, using their cognitive skills, for which we have not necessarily supported them or trained them up on. As you refer to those women in leadership and needing the numbers, we have the numbers in Nepal, but we don't have the skills. And so I bring this to you not with statements of understanding what works, but really struggling with some of the questions that you raised, wanting that conversation with all in the room. And Zina, I thank you very much for this opportunity to really bring together a platform really for this engagement with, from my perspective, both the physical and the cognitive needing attention. Thank you very much.
I don't want to take too much time, but this is such a fascinating discussion. Thank you all. It was really, I think, very, very enlightening and insightful. And I'm particularly grateful, of course, to Wendy and my African colleague, I think, who hit the nail on the head in many, many respects. But I just want to take up this question specifically. Well, basically, the care economy and the occupational segregation, I completely agree with you. That, it's all seen as women's work and is undervalued for that reason. But, it's one of those dreadful kinds of, negative feedback mechanisms where women are in it because it's underpaid because women are in it, then there is a wage penalty even for the men in that work. You find that across the board. One important way of breaking this is actually good quality public employment. That's why I kept emphasizing it has to be good quality. Once it is good quality employment on good terms, you find men also want it. In fact, and this is another story of technological change. The minute something becomes less arduous, less difficult, easier to do, the men get it. In Indian construction industry, we have seen, when it was very physical, when you had to carry stones up and be on scaffolding, there were women doing it. Now it's machines and hard hats and gloves, and the men get to do it. Mechanization of agriculture, same story. So there is, I think, there's a basic way in which the way to make care work more desirable is to actually reward it. And you can't get markets to reward it. You will have to have public employment to reward it. So I think that's, that's one of the things. And of course, then it releases women to do a whole bunch of other things. That's the secondary benefit, I would say, of it. But the other issue is the whole thing about, the very important point you raised about physical cognitive. And, often I find it's not, I've seen this with women in Indian panchayats, because we have 30% reservation of women in Indian panchayats as well. And it's not often that they need the kind of training that people think they need. They want training in accounts. They want training in how to read a budget. They want training in how to make sense of the crazy bureaucratic language that they're forced to deal with. So they want that kind of training rather than the kind of training that too often, the international development industry thinks they need, if you see what I mean. And I don't even think that the men then need the gender sensitization. If there's a smart, confident woman there, they get sensitized. In other words, they learn that they have to deal with them. So I don't know how to put it, but in Nepal today, maybe there are all these women who don't need that kind of training, but need the straightforward skills training that enables them to, just deal with the kind of work. That's right, exactly. And I'm so sorry, last point just on I couldn't agree with you more on this whole issue. I think those three contradictions you raised are absolutely spot on, and we're all guilty of them in our own ways. But I think this issue of implementation, all of us have to be constantly conscious of the unanticipated outcomes. And that requires a degree of social sensitivity to very particular context that even I don't. I don't have it. I need training in that when I go to specific outcomes. We tend to have a kind of universal solution in our head and go with that bullet to different places. So I think that was such an important point that you made. Thanks so much.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, just in response very briefly to that, but one of the things that in being able to get to that level of specificity of understanding the local context and being able to understand what it is that women need, that Panchat example is fabulous actually, is, it's so critical to ask the women. It's so critical to work with very local women's organizations. These are the people who know the most and know what strategies often are very powerful in different settings. So it's one of the things I feel very strongly about, which is why I think being in a context like this is very powerful, because you have a lot of those voices.
Marissa, I want to reflect on another point, which is a lot of the work that you do at Win-Win is actually connect large corporations and the strategies that they might have via their foundations or just as part of their core work to engage with women at the grassroots. And what is changed thinking? Let's talk about some of the mindsets that they might have used or some of the approaches that they were using, say, 10 years back, and how you've seen that evolve in the present context. Are these organizations, large corporations, actually becoming more sensitive? And why are they becoming more sensitive?
Well, one thing you can't do is generalize about corporations in general, or even within a corporation, I suspect, for most of them. And also Win-Win is very new. We're really only two or 3 years old, so I probably can't go 10 years back, though I've been working and thinking about these issues for a while. But I would say that there are many examples. One that just, an easy one that springs to mind is a program that Gap, the Inc., the apparel company, has partnered with some local women's organizations in Central America, in El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, to provide, to adapt a program that they've been doing mostly in factory settings in South Asia for indigenous communities and bring it more into the community setting. And they'd actually tried to do this with a large INGO, and it hadn't really worked. They had the Spanish language stuff, but the ability, what they found when they started working with these indigenous organizations is that they would have like some sessions on managing, you know, I don't know, stress was probably the word that was used. And these indigenous women would look at them and say, we don't have a word for stress. What is that? And eventually through having these conversations, they would say, oh, well, you know, when we greet people every morning, we say, how is your heart today? And is that the kind, you know, and they sort of started to translate this and to work in ways that made it much more accessible and actually quite powerful, but completely adapted and different, but using some of the connections. So, you know, those are things you can't get in a different context, and even when you are working with people who are in some ways local. So there, and in general, I would say that just talking to, again, speaking to the women and actually getting sort of input on, and Theo can speak to this probably more than I, on strategies has been very powerful in terms of figuring out how to, where the most critical interventions are, what is most important. In this area in Latin America, it was really around a lot of reproductive health education and access, and around really granular understanding on how to convert entrepreneurial work into sort of market access.
Yes.
If I can just add to that, in terms of corporations, I absolutely agree with you, Marissa. We can't generalize because they are so different. The thing that I think is really great about this moment in time, and it's a real opportunity for us, is that whether you're at the UN and looking at the SDGs, or looking at the private sector, or looking at civil society, everyone is talking women and girls. There's an understanding about the importance of really breaking this discriminatory framework that has held back 50% of our populations.
But I think what's different now, because I'm 34 and I know growing up, these were conversations that I heard all the time, and I don't know, I had this vague sort of subconscious thinking that, or maybe it was a conversation I heard or something that left an impression in my mind that by 2020, it was going to be okay. We were going to be at gender equality, parity, whatever you want to call it.
Okay, but
So what's different in time now?
I actually think that there are different things. I really do. I look at the choices that my grandmother had, and then I look at the choices that I have, and they are entirely different. They're different at home, they're different in the workspace. You know, my grandmother didn't have the opportunity to travel here. My mother didn't go to secondary school, but she made sure that all of her children could go to university and do what we want. So I think there have been changes, but they aren't enough. And they're not wide enough. It's not enough for 5% of women in this world to have choices and the other 95% to have restricted choices. And so that's part of the scaling up thing for me, but it's also part of the heart and mind thing. I'm here because my mother, my grandmother, and my mother, and my father actually believed in equality, and they brought us up, and it was equality that was very feminist actually, because it was intersectional, because that is what we had seen. But it's not what we've been implementing. And so while I do think that this is a huge moment, I think the UN talks about women very differently to the way they talked about women even 15 years ago. Because, you know, when I worked for UNICEF for a short while, and the way they refer to women basically as being the mothers of children and nothing else used to drive me nuts. And even that conversation has changed. But what I want to say is that we have to take this opportunity to really get corporations to move beyond the talk, to move beyond the rhetoric. And one of the things that I was most impressed about one international corporation who started saying, how do we deal with issues of women's rights? And they started with the real basics and then would come out and say, oh look, we are now almost 50% of women on the board. You know, this is really great. And then the people they were asking, and that was the important thing, they were asking women on the ground about how they were doing, would say 50% of your board means nothing if you are still paying women in your factories differently to men. And in looking at that, they then changed the pay structure on the ground. But also in looking at that, they recognized that the way they had set up promotion opportunities actually endangered women, because very often they were reporting to men who had the power to either promote them or not. And that laid open a whole range of potential for harassment. So they then changed the way in which people were measured and the way in which different types of work was valued, and therefore the way in which women were protected and able to actually progress through the organization. It's a great example. My opinion is that it's like 1 in 1,000, and that that's not enough.
But what are some of, how do we move towards a standardization of this and make it, the norm and not something which is an outlier? What could we do to move in that direction? I know Professor Ghosh brought up quotas. Is that a way forward? Just making sure that there are more women in the workforce, sensitizes the workforce, changes the nature of how work is done within an organization. But some of these issues that you spoke about, how do we make sure that at a granular level they can be standardized?
I mean, it's an issue of scale that you're talking about, but I think, speaking from UNDP and perhaps from the UN more broadly, I think that, in terms of our engagement with corporations, we increasingly recognize it's important. I mean, traditionally UNDP has seen the government as its main partner, but more and more, I think over the last 10 years or so, we've realized that if we want to really influence development in a country like India, where now overseas development assistance is pittance, I mean, it's almost irrelevant, we have to work with the private sector, because if you're going to have impact, that's where that is. And so what we're seeing is that the private sector and corporations are obviously far more concerned about sustainability,
the environment, and if we can put in legislation that mandates those, why can't we put in legislation for corporations to follow on women participation and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, there is a danger with that. I mean, for example, the government in India recently introduced
the Maternity
Act, and it had this perverse outcome that now small and medium-sized enterprises consider employing women more costly and more troublesome, right? So one has to be careful about how legislation is introduced. Personally, I think when it comes to engaging with corporations, I mean, of course we're interested in women for the sake of women's rights, but there's also something to be said for showing with private sector the returns, the profits that's to be made from engaging with women. We shouldn't shy away from that, and why it's good for business. I mean, we see a growth, for example, if you're looking at innovative financing, a growth in impact funds that are looking at creating impact as well as bringing returns that focus on women. Many seed funds, for example, focusing on women. And I think it's very possible to show that by engaging with women, you can create a positive impact and you can be profitable. And I think, whether it be investing in agriculture, investing in renewable energies, any economic sector, by engaging with women, you can actually create profit. So I think that line of argument is important. Within UNDP, we've worked a lot in trying to bring women into non-traditional sectors, and had some success in that. So, for example, just to give some concrete examples, we've been working with IKEA, who you may have seen that they opened a store recently in Hyderabad. We were training and working with IKEA to put the women in the assembly lines to make the furniture, go to people's houses and make the furniture, or serve in customer relations. That's something that companies are realizing more and more is useful to do. We've worked with training women in the steel industry so that they can actually work on the factory floor. We've been training them so that they can ride and get motorbikes, which gives them more assets, gives them more access in public space. And I think these kinds of initiatives do make change at the culture, maybe not in the standard way that you're asking about, but together they create change from sort of bubbling up, bottom-up perspective. Obviously there are challenges. You can train women, but then they don't get jobs. That's an issue. And then you can put women in the workplace, in non-traditional workplaces, and then if the facilities in the workplace aren't appropriate for women, or there's resistance from men in that workplace to the encroachment of women in their area. So there are many challenges, but I think by creating that change from the bottom as well, through many different examples of what works, you can get bigger level change when you work with the private sector, because they're going to have a very big impact on the way development moves forward.
Thank you. 2 points. Sina, you mentioned that you thought that everything was going to be okay by 2020. I have to say I'm optimistic, and I'm optimistic because I have to be. The alternatives are not ones that I would like to visit. And it's because of this. If we understand that people's movements are born out of exclusion, then we ought to look at what people's movements are active, alive, and well today. We have the Me Too movement that speaks volumes the world over. And when we speak to public officials, we need to ask, what are the movements with which you are contending, and what are the messages of exclusion that they are raising? Are we paying attention to those demands? The Me Too movement gives us that basis to say, here it is. You want to ask about scale? It's got scale. You want to ask about standards? We are setting standards. Yes? So it's happening, and I'm optimistic about that. Secondly, I want to distinguish, there is a serious difference between the duty to protect on human rights that states have, as in we need to make sure that sexual harassment doesn't happen, that violence against women, domestic violence is not okay. So that we distinguish as the duty to protect on human rights. That is very different from taking policies of protectionism, where we say to young women, no, you cannot migrate for labor abroad because bad things will happen to you. Where women then bear the cost of your policy in their own name when they didn't even choose it to begin with, right? And so we need to take a look how the dots are in fact connected, but we need to make that connection explicit to say, no, you're making the connection from one to the other, and it doesn't flow well. You know, you're actually making women bear the cost of your protectionist policies. Thank you.
Just one more thing on the corporate sector following up, which is that in the United States today in particular, but I think you see this in the global context as well, is that the companies are certain companies are actually often more progressive than the governments and are producing policies that you would not get out of the governments. Whether they're on sort of in the US, you see this with the transgender issues and really pushing governments to and not accepting certain things and moving out of states in connection with access to reproductive health care for sure. And obviously in many cases in the US where there's very limited parental leave and child care, you have companies, and they're doing this not for any other reason than that. I mean, they do want to do good. I'm not saying they don't have a good heart, but there is a real business motivation with their employees, with their customers, to who they rely on this diverse workforce. So I do think that there is a lot of opportunity and to connect that sort of business case and social case, but I do think that it also, to Theo's point too, you have to work. It's a two-way street, and the power is when you actually can engage on a two-way street and work with a company in the ways that Theo said. So you are the local organizations are actually influencing the change as well as gaining something from the networks and resources of the company.
I think the question that we need to stop looking at this as a good to do. Corporations or the government or even us as women, we need to stop thinking of, hey, the company has given me 6 months maternity leave and that's good of them to have done. It's just basic. They should have been doing it anyway. So I mean, it's just labeling. It comes back to the point that we were all making earlier, is how we label things, what we call out when we do job applications and so on and so forth. Like an example that comes to mind is in the Valley, they did a study on startups, and they found in spite of women being qualified for certain jobs, women weren't applying to roles in tech simply because the roles were titled things like ninja coder or rock star something else, and just women felt that either A, the culture in their organization wasn't going to be conducive to them working there, or B, they didn't see themselves in those titles. They didn't identify with that and therefore didn't think that they were rock star anything or ninja anything, though they were qualified to do those jobs, but they weren't applying for them. So a lot of it is normative in that sense. It's a lot of change in thinking that needs to come from us, and we need to push the borders. Do you think women need to take more aggressive action themselves? Women who are in power and even otherwise need to start changing the way we think about our role in the workplace?
Saina,
I
there
think
is someone has questioned. I mean,
You just take this and take a question.
okay.
I mean, I just want to say that I do think it's a shift in mindset for women and for men. But I also think that we have to call it out when corporations do something that's good until it becomes normalized. I know that company that I was speaking about then almost like set up a challenge with a couple of other companies that they worked with, large international corporations, because it was sort of like, you're getting all the glory for this and we want some of that glory. And then they started almost competing to see who would do better in actually establishing what we know should have been absolutely basic. But I do agree with you that it's all of us changing our mindset and changing what we expect as well as what we do. And I really want to say that some civil society organizations have been really good at that, and I really want to call out the Azad Foundation for that, because what you are doing with the women drivers, it goes back to what you and Professor Ghosh said. You have to see it to really believe it and to aim to have it. And you know, when people see, wow, look at this successful business which gives women social protections, it gives them jobs, it destroys stereotypes, it breaks down discrimination, then they think, oh yeah, we want to be part of this, we want to invest in this. And when that way of thinking becomes normal, that's when we're changing things. And that's the difference between people who want to hold workshops empowering women and people who want to break down patriarchal systems.
I just want to quickly to connect with that. I think so. We have to also think out of the box that working mean related with the corporation. I think like Azad is one example. Initiate our own, they develop our own corporation, women's corporation that's breaking all the stereotyping is one of the alternative. We have to also remember that one lot of issues related with women's now happen because of this the growing massive or transnational corporations. They occupy a lot of opportunity. Dominate. They take up all the resources where actually a lot of initiative can grows from our own context. For example, just one IKEA. So IKEA is a huge global corporate which actually killing up a lot of local corporations. Yes, I think in many other global transnational corporate. I think initiative like Azad and many other small initiatives started with that own control and employed by women themselves is one of alternative that we have to think of. So with this, then we exercise all this, not only give women opportunities for work and earning, but also exercise the power relation between the owners or between the owners and employers. So I think there are many layers of principles in corporation, in a company like Azad, in initiative like Azad and many other things in other countries, where we also showing economic development is not only about profit, it's not only about making money, but it should be also about well-being. It's also about the life. It's about all the connection between different people in this. I think this will in Indonesia particularly all the women's movement and also women in corporate now. We have many business women now have this very clear and aware about this and really building support group for women's entrepreneurs and women startup group, women who would like to start business by not giving up ourselves, become employee of big corporation only for what you call is proud of we are now working in a certain company. But it's more on how we can actually also growing and own our own. So access and control at the same time is very important, I think, for women in order to change this whole notion. I think in terms of what Professor Gus, I think that have a quota in public employment is one need to be discuss further and unpack how actually this will work, because now many countries apply quota for parliament members, for example, decision making, and not all countries can really fulfill that at this stage because of many other layers of power dynamics.
Thank you. My name is Mio Yokota. I'm heading the Women's Economic Empowerment Portfolio at the UN Women Office in Nepal. My question is about the challenge actually we face at the practical level. I can really relate Professor Ho's saying people can change their attitude by seeing examples or feeling examples by themselves, not because by being told or by being taught. And we are actually then, my question, how we can actually present example where a role model didn't exist, doesn't exist, particularly talking about women's participation in MTL. In Nepal, we are trying to actually offer support women to enter the MTL, but when women are asked which occupation or which skills they would like to learn, they tend to go to the very traditional occupations because this is only they've seen entire their lives. And it's just so difficult for us and for our partners actually to encourage women to choose something entirely new. No example exists in the community, particularly when we are working in the rural, remote, and then very much conservative community in Nepal. So that is my challenge I face day-to-day work, and I would like to listen to panelists what are the possible opportunities we can actually take. And I actually, by listening to your talk this morning, I actually already gathered some sort, maybe the combination of the public sector employment and quota reservation may present the opportunities, particularly where maybe private sector companies do not have any interest to invest, or investing like young youth in their formative age to encourage, to provide actually the knowledge and the opportunity to choose non-traditional occupations. And in that sense, I really think the access to the gender-sensitive higher education actually really matters when we talk about women's participation in NTL.
You want to take that, Francie?
I just want to respond on that question, one part of that question, and something that's sort of being discussed here now. I mean, I think what I'm picking up is this, in terms of what I was saying on private sector corporations as being good or bad. IKEA, just to pick up on one that we talked about, bad because it's crushing local opportunity, for example. I mean, the way I would approach it is, it's not useful necessarily to see organizations as good or bad. I mean, they exist and they're working, and you want to try to do what you can to influence their behavior. So, for example, the UN in Indonesia does work with palm oil companies, which have a terrible track record on destroying forests, for example. But it is possible to work with them on sustainable production practices. So I think we need to, and that's partly what I see as the UN role, is to work with everybody and see how you can sort of move them in the right direction, even if it's from quite far on the negative, but move them in the right direction, even if they're not, don't have a great track record. And I think that works with engaging women as well, how you can work with organizations to and look at it as good for business and good for women, whatever the organization. Now this point about some, and there's a sort of state versus market kind of discussion going on here as well. Now, you can, obviously, there's a role for the state to promote gender equality, obviously. But, you said in your question, in areas where private investment isn't interested. Now, I'm very interested in looking at how to create opportunities for private investment in areas that traditionally we wouldn't think would be that. I'm going to take one example, which is waste pickers in India. Waste pickers, bottom of the pile, very vulnerable, very low paid work, unrecognized. But they play a really vital role in society. And there is actually a market opportunity there because plastic recycling is something that creates value. And you can look at ways to put these women plastic collectors and segregators and recyclers at the center of a model that actually creates value. So that's just one example of how you can take an area that you wouldn't traditionally think of as investment friendly, equip women with the skills, with the access to the entitlements to which they deserve, but also create value for women at the center of your model.
Just want to clarify the area that I need geographic locations, not like a sector or industries. Geographic location, particularly where I'm talking about like where we need to work in a very rural, remote setting in conservative village. and where still MTL opportunities are available, but women are not picking it up because they have never seen anyone doing this. So that's how we can actually, the question is how we can create a role model example to encourage women to start taking it.
Theo, you want to, oh sorry, Francie, you
I mean, my quick response to you on that one idea is value chains. I mean, when you have women in very remote locations with very poor access to market, I mean, there's an awful lot of very interesting work going on around value chains that essentially link women up to markets and how to get women to have a bigger role in those value chains.
The company that Theo mentioned actually is a company that they were trying to get more women engaged in farmer field schools, and women couldn't travel, unpaid care reasons, lots of different obligations, lots of other things. So they used digital technology to bring the farmer sort of trainings into the villages. And they did that, of course, in ways that didn't require a lot of literacy, which was also helpful. But the thing that they did that was almost as important, if not more important, was that they had the trainers in the videos be women and be women farmers. And that gave it much more, made it much more real. Now, I don't know if you have access to that kind of technology or do you have women who you can use as role models in that settings, but the ability to bring that in is very
But that technology now, isn't really expensive teleconference. It's a mobile phone. In India you get them, for a few thousand rupees.
And that's one of the things that I wanted to say, that actually one of the opportunities of this time, though it can still be exclusionary because not everyone has access, but it's got way better access than most other types, is that we can use new technology to move across geographies and across sectors. So even if you're working in an area where it feels as if everybody has got no access to seeing the way things can be different, as Marissa gave that example, you can use new technology to change that. But I think also we have to be more adventurous about working across sector. So anything that what you need to be, or what one of the things that you can be doing is actually working with civil society organizations that have been working with groups that might be more conservative in approach, and they've built up a trust at the grassroots so that when they say, oh, look at this video that we just came up and is happening, there is more trust and more willingness to actually try that. We do have the role models, but they may not be in a specific geography, a specific time. But also, we've always had to break glass ceilings. There have always been women who, within larger groups in society, have had to be the ones that stand out. And they're harder to come by, but very often, we don't reward women for courage or for bravery. Instead of rewarding them for being brave, we castigate them and we make it more difficult. And the other thing is just very practical. If people want jobs for money, if you can show them that the non-traditional livelihoods will not only give them more money, but will give them control over their lives and allow them to make decisions and integrate their values and their principles with economic benefits, that makes a huge difference.
I just can't resist a little, sorry, just a quick response to you about Nepal. I was just thinking there are some areas in India that I have always felt there is so much scope for women involvement, and it's a very easy policy measure. There is a thing in India called banking correspondence. I don't know if you have them in Nepal. They close down the bank branches in rural areas and they have a person instead, who goes around doing all of these things, and they basically have a mobile phone and all of that. All of them are men. There's absolutely no reason why they have to be men. You need a high school graduate with minimum training. There are enough women even in the rural areas to do that. Supposing you said 1/3 of them have to be women, or 1/4 of them, for example. Extension services, agricultural extension services, acknowledged, all of them are men. Once again, there is no reason for them all to be men. We don't even encourage women to get into that because we assume that they can't do that kind of thing. And final thing, which is hugely necessary in Nepal and in India, in rural areas, is veterinary training. Now, we are massively understaffed in vets, and you can actually have barefoot vets. People talk about barefoot doctors, but you need barefoot vets. In fact, women are actually doing a lot of that perforce because they do a lot of the local livestock rearing. So if you can give training for vets and actually put a few of them out there, it makes a huge, I'm sorry, I just couldn't resist.
No, don't apologize. Yes, ma'am, you have a question. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am Roshan Mashab from Afghanistan, and first of all, I want to thank you from the Azad Foundation for this great event, and thank you from the Professor Ghosh and our panelists for comprehensive speech. I want to support the opinion of Professor Ghosh, the quota system. It's very working in our countries. Also, we follow this quota system in Afghanistan, and it's working a lot for us for now. And also, I want to have your opinion about the main points for the financial support for the women. In Afghanistan, some women are starting small businesses, but they need money. Some policies are shows that they are they will assist women and aid for women, but they make depends to men. Like that, they provide a small loan or small loan for the small businesses for women, but they want the property documents as a grantee from the woman, and it's the biggest challenges for the woman. There is two main points that some of women are head of family and don't have this property document, and some of them didn't have the support of their husbands or father or brothers to provide them the property documents. What's in your opinion that alternative things to have help with this woman for the grantee of they took a loan from the starting for the business? Thank you.
Should we take that around, actually, access to finance and what you do in this sort of setup, which is not particular just to Afghanistan, but India and all parts of the world, actually, where women don't have ownership of assets, and then therefore how do you justify access to capital?
Yeah, we used to have that kind of situation in Indonesia, and there are this our government, we have do a lot of advocacy work toward government, and the government have different set of policy in order to respond that. For example, for the small micro enterprises, is what without collateral. So it's from smaller until up to maybe $100,000 US dollar. Then there is a facility for women, not only women, but for all not to have a collateral. But other approaches to what they call it poverty alleviation program, which actually through organizing women into groups, and this group then access the government available capital. But then government also have guarantee to the bank, specific bank, appointed several banks to have this program. So it's requirement for the bank to provide certain amount of the capital to be accessed without this collateral system. However, we still also struggle. We still also in having this advocacy work on taxes. So in our country, in women always considered as single, not head of the family. So the we pay a higher tax than men, because we are not considered as the head of the family and not the main breadwinner. Although we are, for example, I'm divorced and I'm the main breadwinner, but I pay tax double than compared to the men. So And for the higher, the bigger businesses, the collateral is still there, but now there are a lot of less requirement on that man has to sign and all the things.
Very quickly. Thank you for that question. I mean, just following on from what Nani said, yeah, there's lots of evidence that other countries are not putting those kind of discriminatory lending policies in place now, where they require, the man to sign, the husband to sign the loan application, or requiring those kind of property guarantees when the property is in the husband's name. I mean, more broadly, with women engaging in business, I think one of the key issues is the connection between the women and the investors, or the women and the lenders and the investors, and that making that connection happen, because typically women would not necessarily have access to the same far-reaching networks that men might have. So I think looking at ways to promote that connectivity or that network for women is really important. Oftentimes, for example, investors themselves may have very gender-biased views of the kind of business to invest in. If it's run by a woman, they may ask different kinds of questions to a business run by men. So there's that gender bias in investors' attitudes that also needs to be addressed. But more than that, from the sort of research and analysis that we've done, I mean, I think women's self-confidence is a big issue. Oftentimes, women will not go out and look for a loan or look for investment because they don't have the confidence or the readiness to take a risk in the same way a man would. So there's work to be done around building women's confidence and confirming to women that their business is investment ready and is, and they should be out there selling it and looking for funds. So I think what can help with that is mentoring. If women can have access to a network of other women who have gone through the same journey and have experience, it can really boost women's self-confidence. The second thing is the capacity building. Now here I'm not just talking about training for the sake of training. I think the kinds of training that we're talking about that are helpful for these kinds of women are, business planning, or someone said accounting, banking. I mean, developing your business plan, looking at how your business can not only start up but grow beyond the initial phase, how to engage with investors, how to actually budget and ensure your business is sustainable and then can grow. Those are the kinds of capacity building that we need more of.
Okay, so I have to say I absolutely agree with you about the more technical training, because I think if you are not, one of the things we have learned, and I know that myself as a black woman working internationally has learned, is that for people to take you seriously, you always have to put in 50% more. You always have to be 50% better. So if you don't have that technical knowledge and qualification, etc., people, it's the only way to make sure that people can't ignore you. I absolutely agree with you about that. What I don't agree about is confidence building. We all actually need to have our confidence built on a regular basis. But what I have really seen over and over again is that if you are a woman and you have all of the technical skills, all of the experience, the fabulous ideas, and you go to bank after bank after bank, and they knock you back, it doesn't matter how much people build your confidence, you're not breaking that discriminatory system. And one of the things I think we all need to be better at is actually integrating with other people. So there are organizations who make it their job to measure what the private sector, what government, what other people are doing, and actually try and push for policies to be implemented. Because there are so many countries where, different parts of Africa, where we have legislation which says, no, your husband doesn't have to sign the loan form. and yet banks will still say, oh yeah, but if you don't have collateral, we can't fund you. And yet other banks in the same country are actually funding women to do that work. So as AWDF, I know one of the things or strategies we've employed is to try and fund those organizations which are either helping banks and corporations to break down their discriminatory systems, or are helping women's rights organizations to bring in cases against discrimination, or helping women's rights organizations form movements within their countries which either come up with alternative finance or push to have the legislation that's there broken down. And that includes women's rights organizations who actually spend their time going around rural areas and teaching women how to safeguard their land, because the legislation is there, but people have not started implementing. So I really feel very strongly that, yeah, we do all need to have our confidence built, and there are many women who don't feel very confident. And frankly, if somebody hits you 4 times for doing the same thing, it's actually common sense not to go back. However, I do think we've got to break these systems down, and that means working together across sectors, across geographies, learning our lessons, and recognizing that this is still such a struggle. And until we work together and collectively, even in this world where everybody's so individualistic, we have to have collective action, and that's where the power of movements come in.
Alright, I know we're completely out of time on this, but I'm just going to ask Wendy if she has any closing comments, and to do that for us, please, to round up the conversation.
Thank you all very much. What a wonderful conversation we've had. We've moved from dimensions of where we had our own personal paths touch on larger issues that affect women across the world, that affect our communities from an economic standpoint. We've heard different perspectives on what we need to be working on. I think that there is general agreement that we have a lot to do. And that convenings like this help bring about new ideas. May I just add to Theo's point that sometimes what we of course say are neutral systems are in fact very sexist, and sometimes it comes down to those systems that collect data. Is there only one space on the form? If there's only one line on the form for a person's name, it's going to be that man's name. So we can actually take a gender audit perspective to see where the systems are serving us. Some ideas have been floated here, some questions. I think that this sets a great start for the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. An eclectic panel and set the tone for the conference perfectly. Thank you very much. And as a token of our appreciation, we would like to give you a copy of the Lady Driver book, and this contains some of the stories of women, underprivileged women who have been trained by Azad and are working as professional drivers. These are lived stories of these women.